Welcome, everyone. This is Laura Podolsky with the National Center for Sustainable Transportation, and we're excited that you're joining us today for our webinar, Do Highways Act as Barriers to Gene Flow for Wildlife Populations? This webinar is brought to you by the National Center for Sustainable Transportation in partnership with the Institute of Transportation Studies here at UC Davis. The National Center is one of 5 national centers designated by the U.S. Department of Transportation as part of its University Transportation Centers program. Our consortium is being led by the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis in partnership with UC Riverside, University of Southern California, California State University at Long Beach, University of Vermont, and Georgia Institute of Technology. Our mission at the center is to advance a more environmentally sustainable transportation system through cutting-edge research, direct policy engagement, and education of our future leaders. Today's webinar is a part of a rollout of new research from our center, co-authored by our speakers today, as well as Andrea Schreier, who's also with UC Davis. The final report is posted on the National Center's webpage, and we'll also be sharing the link to download the report in the chat box throughout the webinar today. So to go over what we'll be covering today, we'll spend our first half of our webinar hearing from our speakers, followed by opening comments from 2 special guest respondents, and then we'll have Q&A with all of you. So I really hope everyone came with questions. As you can probably tell, everyone is on mute, and this is merely to cut down on distractions. So if you hear any dogs barking or anything, then that is totally on us. So if you do have questions, please enter those in the chat box, and then we can get to those during Q&A. And if you have questions on a specific slide, please make note of what slide number so that we can go back to that. Finally, we'll be recording this webinar and posting it to our event page, and also a link to that recording will be shared in our follow-up email, as well as a link to the presentation slides and the full report. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers today, as well as our special guest respondents. So our first speaker will be Dr. Fraser Shilling. He teaches in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at the University of California, Davis, in addition to serving as the co-director of the Road Ecology Center. Dr. Shilling has 3 main areas of research: environmental pollution and policy, transportation and landscape ecology, and sustainability indicator systems for whole system condition reporting. Amanda Coen will also be speaking today. She is a first-year graduate student in the Ecology Graduate Group here at UC Davis. Amanda is interested in researching the impacts of roadway structures on the genetic dispersal of terrestrial mammals, with particular emphasis on the role of road-induced fragmentation and isolation in large carnivores. So after Fraser and Amanda present, we will be hearing from our 2 guest respondents, who I'll introduce now as well. We have Steve Torres, who has served as the supervisor of the Wildlife Investigations Laboratory in the California Department of Fish and Wildlife for the past 10 years. The Wildlife Investigations Laboratory is a statewide program that provides expertise and support for investigating wildlife disease or mortality events, wildlife disease surveillance, monitoring the health status of wildlife populations, oversees and provides training for wildlife captures, and conducts applied research on specific wildlife populations. Jim Henke serves as the Senior Environmental Planner within the Office of Biological Studies at Caltrans. Before coming to this position, he served as a district biologist at Caltrans District 10, located in the San Joaquin Valley here in California. Jim also has worked for a private consulting firm doing biological resource permitting, field surveys, wetland, and endangered species work in the Central Valley and Sierra Nevada. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Fraser and Amanda.
Thanks, Laura. And thanks to the National Center for Sustainable Transportation for supporting our work. I'm going to start off by introducing the general area that we're going to talk about, and then Amanda's going to talk about the study that is the center of this webinar, this presentation. And so I'll talk a little bit about transportation sustainability and how our work fits into that idea. I'll talk also about other ways that we can monitor wildlife, and then some of the consequences of roads for wildlife, and we're going to primarily focus on genetic isolation that can result from busy roads and highways. We're also recognizing that highways are not the only cause of genetic isolation, and there may be land use effects and natural features that also contribute to genetic isolation. We're going to have a discussion of population genetics in our study organism, which is pictured to the right, photograph of the coyote. Talk about the project, the results, and then future goals, and how we can integrate this information into sustainable transportation. There we go. So sustainable transportation is really the basis for a lot of our work in road ecology and any kind of wildlife and ecosystem work in relation to roads and highway systems. And the nexus there is that since most transportation organizations have adopted the concept that sustainable transportation is our future goal or our current goal for future systems, we want to really investigate what that means in terms of wildlife. And there's a really nice quote from AASHTO, the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials, which suggests that the environmental part of sustainable transportation is really about leaving the environment in a better condition that you found it. And the diagram on the left shows it's sort of a classic sustainability stool supported by consideration of economy, environment, and equity and health. And at the same time, balanced on that are all of our different ways that we expect transportation to function, to provide mobility, to be affordable, to be safe for the driver, to be typical, in other words, it's sort of things that we're used to, and to provide access to a lot of areas. So there's a really big balancing act there between the idea of sustainable transportation and our expectations for transportation. When it comes to wildlife, there are many different ways that we can investigate wildlife and wildlife effects of transportation. And the one that we're going to talk about today is population genetics at landscape scale. So thinking about larger scales, and this is really important for understanding how development, including transportation, affects wildlife and ecosystems. And so it's not just the individual species we're concerned about, we're also concerned about the knock-on effects to the ecosystems as a whole. There are other methods that we could use, and these are all related and relevant to the current study because they help us to understand wildlife movement and population connectivity. And these include camera traps, which could be installed at highway structures. So there's a nice picture there of a buck crossing under Interstate 280 alongside a creek that goes under the interstate. You could use track plates, scat surveys, look at roadkill or mortality along highways and roads, collar individual animals, and so there's some Department of Fish and Wildlife staff collaring a deer for a study alongside Interstate 280, and also model disturbance and think about how connectivity at landscape scales might be affected by highways and roadways and traffic. And so when we think about this, think about connectivity and ecological impacts, we're thinking about these large scales, and we're thinking about how landscapes, and I just give two little examples here of parts of different counties where we've done studies looking at connectivity. Landscapes have disturbance. If you look on the map on the right, it shows a study in El Dorado County where the redder the color, the more disturbed, the bluer the color, the less disturbed. And so for rural areas, and this actually includes part of our study area, you have a dispersed set of land uses, including roads and highways. And so the point of our study is to really focus on some of these specific roads and highways and see if they are causing a landscape effect on population genetics. I'm going to switch over here to Amanda Coen, second-year graduate student.
So roads have a couple of different effects on wildlife. Primarily is the loss of habitat as the road surface is created and the supporting infrastructure converts habitat. But there's also behavioral changes in what happens when a road is present in terms of how wildlife perceive that road surface. So organisms can actually avoid crossing due to different effects, primarily disturbance avoidance from light, noise, and vibration resulting from the road characteristics or use of the road. And you can also have open cover avoidance, where there's edge effects, where the habitat transitions from, say, forest to the sudden open habitat that becomes the road surface. And some organisms prefer not to cross areas like that. You can also have roads as an effect in the terms of killing individuals, so mortality events. As individuals are removed from the population, it presents population persistence risks, particularly for small and isolated populations. And for example, it's estimated that over 25,000 deer collisions occurred in California in the year of 2011 to 2012. In this map here, these are reports from the California Roadkill Observations System from 2009 to 2015 for canids that were reported killed along the sides of roads. And what you can see is actually very clear outlines of where major highways go. So this is I-5 going south, north-south here. So in terms of road mortality and aversion, you have the primary concern is that there's decreased dispersal success for organisms that are on either side of this highway. As they fail to cross the roadway, you end up with a disconnect between the populations. So here we have an initial population with two different genetic variants. You have brown individuals and green individuals. And then after a road is implemented, you have two different populations potentially. And there's two outcomes that can come from this. You can have high dispersal between populations where individuals are able to cross the roadway and the variation stays the same on either side of the highway. But if there's no dispersal between the population on either side, over time you can end up with changes in the frequency of those two different types. And so this happens through a process called genetic drift, where random events change the genetic composition of the population over time. And this particularly is a problem because it can reduce the gene pool of the isolated population. So in terms of genetic isolation, for example, the population where the variation is decreased on one side of the highway, you end up with a portion that's isolated and has lost variation over time. And when you have low amounts of variation, there's an increased chance of sharing copies of the same gene from a common ancestor. This process is increased when matings occur between close relatives, referred to as inbreeding. As individuals begin to accumulate more and more copies of genes that are not beneficial to their survival, it reduces their ability to survive and reproduce in a process known as inbreeding depression. And this puts the persistence of a population at risk. For example, Isle Royale hosted a small population of wolves that was isolated from the mainland and over time began to express vertebral deformities. Eventually, they had decreased survival and lower reproductive success, and the population eventually crashed. So our study question is, are highways dispersal barriers? And there was a study in Southern California that found that multi-lane, heavily used Southern California highways showed patterns of disrupted genetic connectivity for bobcats and coyotes. So the question is the same process occurring across major highways here in California, in Northern California? So we examined populations of coyotes on either side of major highways, and we chose coyotes because they're widely distributed, they're common, highly mobile, and they're capable of urban association. And they provide a very conservative model. And there's two potential outcomes. You can detect disrupted gene flow, which has implications for less common or more threatened species, or you can detect connectivity, which could implicate that there are potential dispersal paths across a highway, or identify characteristics of highways that facilitate movement, such as sound walls or fencing, or that organism possesses a trait that allows for better dispersal success. So How we accomplished this was by hiking transects in open space areas within 10 kilometers of the study highways. In the Bay Area, this was 580 and 680, which both show greater than 1,800,000 vehicles per day. Whereas in the Sierra Nevada foothills, our other study area, where we were looking at 50 and 80, there were more than 1,400 vehicles per day. So we collected scats, primarily because coyotes use these as a territorial signal and makes them very easy to find. And anytime we found a scat, we collected a GPS location for them. We extracted DNA from the fecal samples and used a genetic test to confirm that they originated from coyotes and not some other species. And then using microsatellite markers, we DNA fingerprinted individuals. So we identified 31 individuals in the Bay Area and 52 individuals in the Sierra Nevada foothills. So this slide shows the results that we would expect if the highway was actually a barrier for two bisected populations. So we use a program called Structure, where we take individual genotypes and test for population patterns by sorting them into different genetic clusters. These clusters are groupings of genetically similar individuals, and the program can test for a range of populations, which we refer to as K. In this example data set, was tested for 5 potential clusters, and this plot actually shows the mean probability of the data fitting each of those predicted K values. So the bars that go through here are the variance, how well the data actually fit. And how we determine what is the most likely value for the population clusters is where that variance is the smallest. So in this example, we found that the K equals 2, which means that there's 2 genetic clusters, is most likely. And the output that we get is a graph. So each of these columns here, these bars that are surrounded by white lines, represent an individual organism. The black bar is just a separation in between the 2 different genetic clusters, which are represented by the colors blue for one cluster and tan for the other. So our results for the Bay Area suggest that there's no structuring across highways. This is our study area. You have 680 running north and south, and then 580 running west and east. All of the green surrounding areas are actually where we did our hiking transects. And our results show here that it looks most likely that there are 2 genetic clusters, but these clusters didn't correspond with either side of the road. So here we have East 680 and West 680. They look similar, except that West 680 has more of the blue-colored individuals. But they show similar degrees, and this large number of blue individuals is actually from this population down here in Dublin, which was comprised of a large number of related individuals. In the Sierra Nevada foothills, we found, again, no structuring across the highways, but instead of finding 2 populations, we actually had evidence that it was more likely to be one connected population. So here we have 80 running southwest northeast, and then 50 running east-west. And here, if we look at the genetic difference, which is the amount of genetic difference between individuals, where each of these points is a different individual, you see that they kind of all cluster together as one cloud with a few outlying individuals that are more distinct than the rest of the group. So regardless of what side of the highway they were on, they all managed to cluster together as one group. In summary, from these results, it suggests that populations of coyotes in both regions showed genetic connectivity, but this is much stronger in the Sierra Nevada region than in the Bay Area. For the Bay Area, there's weak substructure that results from increased relatedness in the Dublin area, and it could suggest that there's little gene flow into or out of this region. As far as the genetic connectivity, this is a best-case scenario because coyotes are highly mobile organisms and have large populations. Connectivity might be due in part to passage, but based on camera trap data, coyotes don't use culverts in either of these two regions. So the question is, are coyotes crossing on the road surface, or are they using crossers, particularly in the Sierra Nevada region, are they using crossing structures at higher elevations, which we have evidence for, and then moving down into our study area? There's also an alternative that this is evidence of past variation. So large populations tend to have high amounts of genetic variation, and as such take time for the loss of this variation through genetic drift and inbreeding to become apparent. And highways may in fact be a barrier, but because large populations take longer to display evidence of fragmentation, and depending on the size of that population and the degree of genetic diversity of the population at the time of initial fragmentation, it may take up to 50 or 100 years for that signal to be able to be detected. For future directions, the state of California is projected to increase in population, and in particular the Sierra Nevada foothill region is projected to increase from 11 to 18% in the next 10 years, which will result in greater road use. Going forward, we plan to examine populations across State Road 49 in Placer and Nevada counties, which is, in this region in particular, is going to have higher growth rates than the Sacramento Valley area. And it's a highway that's 2 lanes across but has fewer passage points on the road surface or below the road surface. And instead of just looking at coyotes, we'd like to look at connectivity relative to body size, dispersal distance, and disturbance tolerance using gray fox and other species in comparison. And then examine the difference additionally, we'd like to look at the difference between what we found this year and what they found in Southern California and figure out what's different about these highways in these 2 different study areas that leads to different results, with a goal of being able to better inform transportation planning for wildlife.
All right. Thank you very much, Amanda. This is Fraser Shilling again. And I'm just going to finish up with a couple of slides to discuss what is different about highways and what we can do with these kinds of results. So the fact that structuring was not found in the populations suggests that a different kind of structure, the structures we're familiar with that cross the right-of-way, may be useful for animals, in this case coyote, to go through and maintain their genetic connectivity. And some of these might be structures that are built for wildlife. So the picture in the middle showing a buck is a structure built under State Route 50, and that is a very effective structure for moving a few species of animals, and it is on the edge of our study area. However, coyotes have not been detected going through this structure. And that's fairly typical for a lot of our structures at lower elevations in the Sierra Nevada. There's another example of a culvert on the left with a bobcat about to go through. That's a very effective structure. It's a drainage culvert going under Interstate 80 in the study area, and it has a lot of wildlife movement but no coyotes. So for a lot of our structures within the study area, whether they are drainage or railway crossings or built for wildlife such as the one under State Route 50, we're not seeing coyote movement in particular. And actually there's only a few species that do move through these structures, so it's really important for those species, but there may be an issue with biodiversity in general. So one of the really critical things about these is that the infrastructure is providing this function, but in most cases it's not intended for that function. So I see a lot of our participants are DOT staff, and you know that most of the structures out there were not built for wildlife, and any wildlife use is fairly incidental. In our study areas, both in the Sierra Nevada and the Bay Area, it's very likely that one of the reasons we didn't see structuring in populations is because wildlife are making opportunistic use of structures going over or under the highway, or even occasionally successfully crossing the highway surface, although with the amount of traffic we're talking about, that's probably not a very likely event. Another way we can think about highway structures, and this is really getting a bit imaginative, is to look at the diagram on the right, and that's really taking the highways out of the landscape surface as a whole. This was a great paper by Richard Foreman, one of the parents of road ecology, and Dan Sperling, the director of the Institute for Transportation Studies, in a 2011 Nature article where they proposed that transportation to maintain biodiversity and sense of community, transportation structures really needed to be elevated out of the way, out of ecosystems, while still maintaining that connection function for people. So just something to think about. When we come back to how do we do this, this is a diagram from planning folks in Caltrans of how planning happens, and this is just actually a simplified version of some of the diagrams that are used for planning. But really what it helps us to do and helps remind us is that there are locations in existing transportation planning and hopefully sustainable transportation planning where we can take these ideas of wildlife movement and genetic connectivity and start to use them in our state planning. So on the left and moving to the right, there's how do we think about state planning in terms of providing funding for structures that help with ecosystem function, and then over on the far right, that's a specific set of steps that are used to build projects. So for any regional set of projects that are planned, ecosystem and landscape connectivity can be considered. There are definitely places for this kind of consideration in the planning structure and the planning documents. And then for specific transportation corridors and specific projects, there are locations such as the initiation document and some of the design documents where movement of wildlife can be considered and facilitated so that we can keep this function going into the future. And with that, I'd like to thank Caltrans and the National Center for Sustainable Transportation for providing support for this program. And we have a lot of partners, and maybe you'd like to acknowledge your field and other folks?
Yeah. So in particular, I'd like to thank the Genomic Variation Lab and the Road Ecology Center and the UC Davis Veterinary Medicine Center, all here. And then in addition, people that helped out were Ben Sachs, Zach Lonsberry, and Alicia Goodbla, and my field interns who helped find all of our samples out on the trails. And Andrea as well. Yeah.
Your supervisor.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Fraser and Amanda. Really appreciate that presentation. I mean, it was short, but I know a lot of work went into that. So I would like to turn it over to our guest respondents, Steve Torres and Jim Henke. I'm very happy to have them both joining us. And I might just point to Steve, if you would provide your opening thoughts, reaction, and commentary to the research presented today, as well as some of the larger ideas on how to facilitate wildlife movement in areas that have highways.
Sure. The Department of Fish and Wildlife, this is of course an important issue, particularly in light of the future stressors and challenges that I think wildlife face in terms of numbers of roads and volume of traffic, but also climate change and things like that. We've done a lot of work with respect to large mammals, namely deer and mountain lions and bighorn sheep, in terms of these, somewhat retrospectively looking at how they move around the landscape and what might be potential barriers. A real technological, improvement for us was the use of GPS collars and them becoming slightly cheaper, and we use those a lot on animals, and we get a much higher level of resolution and can look closer at where might be barriers, but also just not the principle of barriers from a genetic standpoint, but also a direct population and numbers standpoint, besides being a mortality factor. When you change the landscape in a way that may interrupt, say, deer or winter range or something like that, you really reduce the potential of wildlife populations in terms of how many numbers a particular area will support. We've done work. There has been individuals and other scientists that we have collaborated with and or have worked independent, such as Dr. Winston Vickers and some others down in Southern California that have demonstrated some genetic isolation of mountain lions in the Santa Ana Mountains, and that's an extremely fragmented area. We've also been looking at how bighorn sheep populations distribute themselves in these island populations in Southern California. But I could go on and on with the different studies, but I think as we have more data at the resolution of with the GPS collars, and we are doing a lot more on deer in the Central Valley and other areas, I think that will feed in nicely to this type of work, because I think it's really important. The Western U.S. has is lucky in that it has a lot of public lands, so we do support large mammal populations, whereas the Eastern U.S. doesn't quite have that. But at the same time, this is a significant stressor to the viability of those and our ability to manage them. And particularly as we look at some sensitive species such as endangered populations, peninsular bighorn sheep, which are federally listed as endangered. They're down in the Palm Springs into Mexico, and there's some significant barriers from roads there. It'll be one of the things we're following right now that's somewhat interesting is that as wolves come back into California, we're looking at we'll eventually be monitoring those animals, and as opportunity permits, putting GPS collars on those and seeing how they move the landscape and also what might be barriers to them and their reestablishment in the state.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. And so now I'd like to invite Jim Henke to provide his comments, reactions, thoughts on this research and, again, this larger issue of wildlife movement in the landscape.
Thank you to the NCST team and the UC Davis team for this research. It's important for us to inform our folks here internally here at Caltrans, as well as partnering with our external stakeholders on these type of efforts. Caltrans has a vested interest in sustainable development of infrastructure, and it's really critical to provide this type of support and research about wildlife and connectivity, and for us to be able to also communicate that to our internal folks here in our various functional units, such as our engineers, our planning folks, which Fraser highlighted, Dr. Shilling highlighted. These things are especially important to understand as far as genetic makeup of populations, are especially important to understand as changes to the environment highlight the need for Caltrans to consider these species and connectivity as early as possible in the planning phase. And in order to efficiently and effectively include considerations for mitigation through the planning, programming, and the project delivery processes. Again, we really appreciate these types of studies to help inform us here at Caltrans. Currently, we've been doing a lot of outreach, especially with our planning folks, on how to incorporate crossing mitigation into our projects, essentially. And so there's more to come on that. And and through various programs within our process. So that's about all I have at this point.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Jim. So this is a time to please enter questions in the chat box, and those can be for our speakers. We did not hear from Andrea Schreier, but she is here in the room with us as well, and she is one of the co-authors. So we even have a greater pool of knowledge here with us on this webinar to respond to questions. Or you can ask one of our guest respondents today a question as well. So we do have a couple coming in, so I'll take one of the first questions. And this one is asking about the research project specifically, and it was wondering were access controls like fencing and average daily traffic quantities factored into the study? Can you talk more about that?
So both highways actually had central medians that were the same, so it was a solid median barrier, and the average traffic daily volume for both areas was only different by 40,000 cars a day on average. But as far as fencing, they were...
No, both areas vary quite a bit in terms of the parallel fencing, Matt, and so the condition, and obviously the traffic conditions vary from night to day, but the important thing about fencing that you bring up is that there's going to be some fencing and then no fencing, and it's low fencing and high fencing, but at the scale that we're looking at, with the potentially a population fragmented across a say 20-mile stretch of highway, there's plenty of places where the fencing's non-existent or low enough that coyotes aren't going to have a problem with that. The median barrier, that's a sort of a classic problem because especially for lower slung animals, a 3 or 4 foot high median barrier looks like a wall from the side of the highway. They can see habitat on the far side if it's a hillside, but it could be that that just looks like a wall, and then of course is the wall of traffic. Does that answer your question, Matt? I know you're muted, but you can type in the chat box.
I know I'll just say all the speakers we can see who's requested the questions or submitted them. So if you had additional information or additional questions, please let us know in the chat box. So let's go to our next question. Again, this is regarding the research study. Is there, or broader too, it sounds like, is there a correlation between road types or traffic volumes and increase for potential for genetic barriers? And then as a follow-up, has there been models created to help predict this?
So road type has been shown, and it tends to be road density more than road type. So as there's more dense road in an area, both secondary, like small suburban area, into large primary arteries that feed onto highways, you end up finding more and more disconnect in the genetic connectivity. But looking across differences in width of highway or specific features of highway is something that's still an avenue to be explored.
Which your 49 study, Highway 49
yeah, which is, yeah, the Highway 49 study is starting to tease at that, because we've got one side of Highway 80 where it's multi-lane heavy use, and then 49 is 2 lanes but heavy use.
So I think that another way to answer it is a little indirectly, and not so much that it's been shown that there's a genetic barrier effect for road types and volumes, but there's definitely animal behavior effects in response to different road types and different road traffic volumes, and also that those behavioral effects vary between species or among species. So different species will have different reactions to different widths and types of roads. So a dirt road might be something that some species will cross, but they won't cross a paved, or if they cross a paved, they'll cross something that's a very short sight distance but not a long sight distance. And then also for traffic volume, at very low traffic volumes, you might have a fair amount of cross-surface traffic, but at higher traffic volumes, for those species that are sensitive to noise and light, they will have that aversion effect that Amanda referred to earlier. And so that could lead to a genetic effect for certain species that are very sensitive, but that hasn't been well investigated. Certainly, you would anticipate it, but not well investigated.
And I think as a follow-up too, if I might prod a little bit on tools. I know everyone wants that magic tool that will give them the answer. And is any of Amanda, Andrea, Fraser, or Jim or Steve on the line, aware of tools available or models that can help predict these things? Excuse me. To predict how they affect different roads or density of roads will affect wildlife movement, which is a precursor to genetic isolation, correct?
The tools that have been developed are really pretty closely related to your question that you might ask. So if you have a wildlife behavior question, it's different from a population genetics question, and then the tools will be related to those. I think what we're coming to is that to understand overall effects on wildlife populations, why they're fragmented, how much they're fragmented, and what kind of effect that might have genetically and otherwise, you need a set of tools, really. And so there's probably a minimum set. Certainly genetics will come in there. GPS collars and camera traps might be an example of your minimum set to understand how wildlife are interacting with the highway from a live sense. From a mortality sense, obviously, it would be mortality survey.
Okay. So no fancy crystal ball model that you can plug in and it will tell you.
No,
okay.
And also that varies with species too.
Okay. All right. I just wanted to make sure that we were hitting on that for those, the DOTs or transportation agencies that would probably really appreciate something like that. So we do have a second question, and this one I believe is more of talking about the differences between the Southern California study and the Northern California study. And so the question is, given the possibility that it can take a longer time for genetic isolation to show up in a large population, did the research evaluate differences in highway-sized traffic amount, patterns, length, et cetera, between the Southern California study and then the Northern California?
That's actually something we're going to go forward with in the future because we didn't know if there was structuring already present. So that's definitely something we're interested in modeling to see what the differences are.
Between those two studies. Okay, so more to come on that.
Yeah.
And is that a project currently underway or seeking funding?
We're always
funding. So for anyone on the line that might have some funding, that sounds like. Okay, so that's good to know.
So besides that, though, I think part of the intent was to come up with somewhat similar situations to the Southern California study so that we can see how much we can generalize these effects. And once structuring was found to not be present, then we started to wonder, okay, so is it something about traffic volume and how long there's been high traffic volumes or medium barrier or the availability of other crossing structures under the highway? So once we didn't find the same effect, we started looking for those other answers. And I suspect that the questioner's question is actually a lot of those issues are part of this, are the kinds of things that we're going to find.
Definitely.
It's going to be length of time there's been a barrier effect, size of the population, et cetera. Yeah.
Okay. So we'll say more to come. That research is somewhere. It's going to happen in the future. And when it does happen, we'll be sure to have another webinar. We'll just make that promise. So our next question is talking about different passage structures. We know that's important for genetic dispersal. So did you, in this research project, is there any certain passage, or not for this research project, but just in commentary, is there certain passage structures that would be the best for large mammals? And as a follow-up question, what about variation cost, which is that's always going to be a top question for, I know, a lot of the transportation agencies funding this, or the ease to implement. So what kind of passage structures are best for these large animals, and can you comment on ease to implement and cost?
Well, the easiest to implement are the ones that already serve, that are part of the infrastructure of building the highway initially. So things like drainage culverts they're already included in the design. But when you're starting to get into things like land bridges or designs that go over the surface or require widening of culverts, then you start adding into the cost of augmenting the already built structure.
Yeah. And this is a really critical question, and it's usually addressed by thinking about new structures for wildlife. But because those are so seldom built in California and they are quite expensive, it's really worth thinking about the existing structures that Amanda brought up. These are almost always underpasses because we don't have that many tunnels. And these are the most effective, and I'm using some collaboration with District 2 to think about this, are the ones that are bridges over rivers or creeks. In District 2, District 4, and District 3, and other places in the country, obviously, we've found that where there are bridges that are high up above the landscape, usually crossing a large waterway, you're going to have the most effective use. So that's an existing structure that was built for another purpose that's providing wildlife passage, but it's only providing wildlife passage if we haven't gotten in our own way or in their way and put a road through it or a fence across it or a hiking trail. A lot of people with dogs will also cause wildlife to not use crossing structures. So if we think about our existing structures, we can really save a lot of money. And then for places where there's evidence that passage is not very effective, especially in the Sierra Nevada, sort of our crown jewel for California, there are highways that don't have effective passageway, and that's probably where we want to think about these land bridges, which are the most effective structures for getting animals across highways.
And I might turn that question also, Steve or Jim, you're in the field, you're a practitioner, you're dealing maybe more so at the front edge of implementing these crossings or preserving existing structures that wildlife are moving. So would either of you want to comment on this question of appropriate structures for passage, ease of implementation, and cost?
Yes. This is Jim. We have done, we contracted with Western Transportation Institute back in 2013 to do a cost-benefit analysis of what it was a hotspot analysis / cost-benefit analysis, prioritizing safety, conservation, and cost of these structures for segments of highway within our area of District 10, which is out of our Stockton office, which encompasses Tuolumne, Mariposa, Amador, Calaveras, Alpine, Merced counties, those areas there. And what we found is that fencing and undercrossings provide a benefit that in the long term, or provide a long-term benefit that comes even with cost when you look at cost of collisions and in ecological value. So we have taken a look at those, and I would like to see more of those types of studies done throughout, especially throughout the northern part of our state, where we don't have that type of data to support some of those decisions that we make as far as mitigation is concerned.
Now, just a quick, before I turn over to Steve, now, Jim, you were mentioning this cost-benefit analysis, and it showed fencing and undercrossing showed a benefit. Now, were these new undercrossings, or did this analysis that you included look at just existing culverts or other drainage ditches potentially that wildlife was using?
Both. There are a lot within those areas and those segments of highways that we looked at. We did have existing structures that animals were in fact using, and so, like Fraser said, no pun intended, we can get the best bang with our buck on looking at looking at existing structures and seeing how we can retrofit those structures or include fencing, driveway, cattle guards, things like that, so we can direct wildlife into a successful crossing structure and get them on from one side of the road to the other. So we looked at both.
Okay.
And it varied for, segment by segment and hotspot by hotspot, essentially.
All right, perfect. And Steve, did you have anything to add to this? Again, what structures are most appropriate, cost, ease of implementation?
I don't have anything on cost. I mean, I can, with respect to the large mammals, I mean, it really depends on the species as to what kind of crossings most effective. I agree with, I think it was Fraser that said the bridges are generally the most successful. Of course, they're quite expensive. There was an example in Arizona where by the Hoover Dam they were increasing the size and volume of a highway that would really interrupt, and they had monitored bighorn sheep, a large bighorn sheep population nearby, and they really wouldn't use the undercrossing, even the large type culverts. But as soon as they built a land bridge that went over, they used it within days. And I think, even in the case with deer, and I know there's a picture of a deer walking out of a large culvert, you have to remember that a lot of these, if they're built under major highways, they'd have to be very long and they'd be, in many cases, very dark. And I don't know, it really depends, but I don't see, I just think the overcrossing is the most successful, but of course it's expensive. But maybe in the planning phase, it could be integrated into the landscape and the natural topography where it wouldn't be as bad. The other thing I think that isn't it'd be good to consider alternatives to the uninterrupted center divide, because I think no matter what kind of undercrossings you make, I think there's critters that are just going to use the highway. But right now, I think there is increased mortality and fragmentation, and if there were a way of recognizing that's not a solution, because there's still the human safety issue with respect to wildlife on the highway, but it'd be at least a bit more of a passageway, depending on where these were done.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. We did have a follow-up question that came in, and so I'm going to ask that now. And this was for Jim, actually, and it was asking, how difficult has it been to modify culverts or undercrossings that have been known that wildlife are using those when there's a repair or reconstruction planned? And if you experience with that, Jim, of actually modifying existing culvert?
Not offhand. I know that our districts have done some culvert modifications and included things like benches for culverts, and it really depends on what the culvert is being used for. Most culverts are used to get water from one side to the other on the road, and so we have to consider hydraulics and hydrology and stormwater and water quality and things like that. We also have to consider maintenance. So it really depends on what the culvert is being used for, size, what the size is, what the design capacity is, and then what species we're trying to pass from one side to the other. So I know that's kind of a squishy answer, but it really depends on a lot of factors, a lot of variables.
Okay, I know Fraser has a comment too, but I also want to make sure I'm capturing the full question from this person. But they were curious too to know if there is more of a programmatic way when doing maintenance or reconstruction on a culvert to consider the wildlife crossing. And so, currently, is that a part of a Caltrans protocol at all?
For fish passage, it is not necessarily for wildlife right now. For fish passage, yes. If we touch it, we have to remediate it if it's a fish passage barrier.
Okay, great. I just want to make sure that I'm capturing that full question. And Fraser, did you have something to add on?
Yeah, for most states this is fairly discretionary, but for some states like Vermont, after Irene, they really made an effort to, since they had to do so many culvert and bridge modifications, they made an effort to include wildlife passage as a part of every retrofit consideration. And other states, Minnesota, DNR partnered with the DOT to try to make sure that happened as well. So I think it's taking off across the country, this idea of cheaper retrofits to make sure wildlife passage was facilitated on existing structures. But I think one of the most common comments in California is that there's just not a funding source or a box to check that really allows most district biologists or planners to do this.
Okay, great. We have a lot of questions. If we don't get to them all today, we'll definitely take note and follow up with you individually, I promise. So this was another one that came through, again, talking about crossings. So it was stating, the question is, obviously wildlife fencing and crossings around, under over highways are expensive. So in areas with higher mortality of large mammals, what will it take to fund these crossings? And is there support for that? So that sounds like a question for Jim, Steve, Fraser, Amanda. I think everyone could probably weigh in on this. What is that current pot of funding that is available, to help to mitigate this?
Well, this is Jim. What I would say is that the earlier in the planning process that we can consider wildlife crossing mitigation, the better. There has to be a transportation nexus for us to be able to do the crossing generally, unless the crossing's built under a environmental enhancement grant or a transportation enhancement grant. We have to have a transportation nexus. So to answer the question in short, the crossings get funded by the project, by the transportation project. And again, the earlier we can get considerations for wildlife crossings, so in our transportation concept reports, in our corridor studies, at the planning level, the better, so that we can carry these types of mitigations through planning, programming, the project initiation document, which is our scoping process, and through the project delivery process. And we are currently working internally here to make sure that those considerations, that we follow those considerations from planning through the project delivery process.
Okay.
Typically, CEQA or the Endangered Species Act is really what our triggers are for including crossing structures in our project delivery process.
Okay, great. I know we just have a couple more minutes, so I do want to get to a couple more that were specific to the research, and I'm going to combine both of these two questions here. So one is asking about, is there any good databases or sets of information that we can access regarding migration gene flow patterns overall? So that's the first question.
Not really.
That I can think of.
No. There's starting to be more combining of data. It's actually a really good example of someone in the Rockies, I think, who started to pull together collar data from multiple studies into one giant database. And I think that would be a really good model approach, is to start doing that. But I don't think that's the case for wildlife.
Genetics.
This is Jim. Our CDFWs, aren't they redoing their deer management plan? And isn't some of that information on migration corridors going to be included in that management plan?
The one they came out with was a strategic sort of vision document. I don't know that it I'm certain it put a priority on that. You know, it's fairly, I think the department, as it accumulates more GPS data, I think it should be housed in a way to make it available for this as it may relate to animal movement, et cetera. And so I'd like to I would look forward as that information comes in. Unfortunately, you know, it's part of as we study the animals, we're not necessarily studying them in the areas that are most fragmented because most of the large mammals populations there have been compromised. But I think in these other areas where we do have a wealth of data, it'd be nice to have that part of some process to feed into management decisions for highway reconstruction.
Okay, great. I know. I'm sorry, Steve. What was that?
I was going to say the Highway 49 one I thought was an interesting example that was mentioned earlier, because if there's an opportunity there to look at a lot of data that's probably available, and also watch it through a process where it goes from goes to a much busier highway.
Great. I know we are a little bit over our webinar time, and I appreciate everyone who's hanging on. Fraser would like to provide a quick closing comment, and then I'll provide a wrap-up. So, Fraser?
Yeah, and actually, just part of that comment is anybody who's asked questions that we haven't answered yet, we'll make an effort to get back to you and answer those either right now after this webinar or by email. And I just wanted to follow up with something that Jim was talking about, Jim Henke, that if we only think about wildlife crossing as something that you do as part of mitigation for a transportation project, then we're probably going to miss a lot of opportunities. Another way to think about it is like 1% or 10% of funding for wildlife, where we plan for wildlife crossing structures as their own projects. And so we don't have to just mitigate for transportation impacts through the typical project delivery process. We can also start delivering projects for wildlife as well, which will also have safety benefits, obviously, for human drivers.
All right, that's great. So thank you. I just want to thank all of our speakers again today. Thank you so much, Amanda, Fraser, and Andrea, who you all did not get to hear, but she is here in spirit as well as in our room with us. And I also like to thank Steve and Jim as well for joining us. This has been a great discussion. I do want to draw everyone's attention to an email that you'll be getting in your inbox later today. It will include, again, links to everything and also a survey. That survey is going to ask you about your experience on the webinar today, but it'll also ask you your thoughts on where do you feel the future directions for this type of research should go. And we're always interested to hear from those working in policy or practice to provide that feedback to us. So please take that survey. I do also want to point out that our next webinar will be on June 1st, so mark your calendars. This topic is very different from the one that we talked about today, but you might know some of your colleagues who might be interested, or you might be as well. And that will be on intelligent transportation system solutions that reduce fuel use and emissions. And that webinar will feature Matthew Barth with UC Riverside, and he will share his findings from his latest white paper from the National Center that examines the state of the practice for intelligent transportation system approaches that reduce fuel use and emissions. And we also have two great guest speakers, Marco Anderson from Southern California Association of Governments and Samir Rahab from ITS Research Engineer, who is a ITS Research Engineer with Honda. So thank you again for everyone who attended today. We'll get to your questions, and please reach out to us if you have any additional comments or questions yourselves. I hope everyone has a good rest of the day. Thank you so much.